In this video, we're going to look at the concept of the community capitals as a framework. And if we look at this first diagram offered by Flora and Emery in 2008, we can see a series of overlapping and interrelated Venn circles, forming a Venn diagram. And if you look closely within each of those circles, you'll see each individual type of capital, starting with built and natural capital, circling around to cultural, human, social, political, and financial capital. And of course, we can look between the way these things overlap, and of course this will provide a holistic and broad way to think about planning and development for communities. So what about the term capital? A lot of people don't like it. It's a metaphor, and it's also something literal, but generally what it means is any resource that can be invested to create more resources. So if we take time to invest in our natural capital, for instance, the environment, maybe through protection, then that effort will be repaid with maybe people visiting and spending tourist dollars enjoying that environment. Right? So it's the assets of a community, and those assets generate some kind of return. This idea of the community capitals was first developed by Jan and Cornelia Flora as a conceptual framework for thinking about community change and development. And as we'll see as we finish this presentation, it's highly compatible with a sustainability framework. So we're just going to quickly walk through each of these capitals, talk about what they mean, and go from there. So natural capital is the base on which others depend. This is the natural environment, and it's a source of resources such as energy, food, and fiber, and it's a source of amenities and provides aesthetic qualities and beauty that oftentimes can be capitalized on. The question is, how do we value nature, and whose values are going to take precedent over others? Because not all of these uses of nature are compatible, right? And one of the key challenges to natural capital is the growth machine ideology that we mentioned in other presentations. Built capital is largely referring to infrastructure, so your roads, your bridges, your sidewalks, your sewers, your water lines, transportation, electrical grid, internet, everything that supports social life. And investing in those things will provide a return on investment in terms of making a community maybe more attractive to employers. One of the key challenges there is privatization, as these infrastructural networks are often public. There's a real push to privatize things, and a lot of times this infrastructure is decaying and underfunded. Next we come to financial capital, which is probably the most familiar use of the term, and is probably the most literal as well. Capital is often used as a metaphor in the framework, but here we're talking literally about capital, which includes things you can own, stocks, bonds, and those kinds of things. And of course, investment in financial capital can bring a return on investment, not always. And sometimes money is just spent on consumption, and that's not an investment, right? Challenges to community financial capital have to do with the delocalization of financial institutions. A lot of local communities are having a hard time finding lenders who are willing to take a chance on small businesses. And as local banks either get sucked up into larger banks or else just go out of business, local capital becomes more scarce, right? Political capital in a community refers largely to the extent to which power in the community is shared. And so in other words, if a community has just a few very powerful individuals, we would say it has low political capital. And if everybody has some say and some voice and some power, then we'd say that the community has a high level of political capital. And political capital is important in terms of promoting community capacity for problem solving and over the long term, right? So this is sustainability related. Next is human capital, and this largely refers to individual skill and ability. And so this directly is related to education and health, right? So the more we invest in the education and health of people, the greater will be the return on investment as we have a healthy and productive workforce, for example. The challenge there is that we don't always do a good job of funding and maintaining quality schools or healthcare organizations. Social capital actually is somewhat of a complicated term because it has a couple different meanings, but generally it has to do with the resources available in social networks. And access to those resources comes as a result of individuals having a high level of trust and reciprocity with one another. There's two types of social capital that we'll discuss here and in other places. One of those is bonding, which has to do with really close ties you have to people. The other is bridging, which has to do with what Granovetter called weak ties. Those are important for networking in a professional organization, for example. And mutual reliance between community members does give a return on investment as people kind of scratch each other's back. A great example of that is the traditional barn raising, where everybody in the community comes together in order to help the individual family. And that's something not unique to barns, obviously. So a real challenge to social capital then is the rise and tide of individualism and the resulting free-riding norms that might come about. And lastly, we've got cultural capital, which has to do with beliefs, values, and norms that lead to some kind of lifestyle. And to a large degree, these things are related to social class, as lifestyles vary quite a bit by social class. Cultural resources include museums, art institutions, performing arts, activities, so on, recreation. And cultural capacity has to do with the ability of a community to solve problems to a large degree. And that will be enhanced by greater cultural heterogeneity, where you've got more diversity in the community. Challenges to this have to do with a devaluing or undervaluing of culture and an abusing of privileged status by those in the upper echelons of social class. So in thinking about the community capital's framework as a whole, we can say that each type of capital can be equally supported and pursued if the goal is to create sustainability, and we might call that smart growth. That's not a new term, that's been around a while, but that's sort of the opposite of what we also call the growth machine, which is privileging one type of capital, usually it's financial capital, to the detriment of the others. And that's a dangerous road to go down. And a number of challenges need to be overcome to pursue smart growth as a dominant paradigm. So I'd like to close by presenting this idea of the sustainable capitals pyramid, and this is actually my creation. And essentially it takes a look at each of those capitals, but it provides them with a hierarchical ranking. And where at the bottom we have natural capital, and that's where life is actually possible. You can actually live in a healthy environment. Once we have built capital, excuse me, the possibility of social life becomes real as we have infrastructure and housing and those kinds of things to provide a place for community to happen. We then need a system of political and economic capital in place, because that has to do with resource systems, right? Figuring out ways to supply people with the goods and services they need, and coming up with fair decision-making processes. And finally, after those three pieces are all in place, we get to the top, which includes human, social, and cultural capital. And of course, human has to do with being healthy and educated. Social capital has to do with being embedded in social networks, so we're not isolated. And cultural capital means we have access to those things that make life worth living, the arts, and so forth. And that will conclude our discussion of the capitals framework. Thank you.